For nearly a century, rats infested every corner of Charleston. Snakes slithered through rice fields, crawled beneath churches, nested inside ship hulls. They went everywhere. Except here. Not one rat. Not one snake. Not ever. Hidden behind rotting plantation walls, beneath collapsing slave quarters long erased from maps, investigators kept finding the same impossible detail. Entire buildings untouched by vermin, as if nature itself had drawn a boundary and refused to cross it. Locals whispered that animals knew, that something buried in those quarters was older than the city, older than slavery, older than prayer. The records never mentioned it. The churches never preached it. The families who owned the land never spoke of it. But the slaves did. In fragments. In forbidden hymns. In coded prayers that never reached heaven. Because whatever lived in those quarters did not fear God. It demanded something else. And Charleston kept building over it. Charleston between 1800 and 1850 was a city of rot wrapped in elegance. White columned homes rose above swamps thick with decay. The wealth flowed upward. The suffering stayed below. Slave quarters were never meant to last. They were built cheap, rebuilt often, erased easily. Which made it impossible to explain why certain quarters endured, wood unrotted, foundations untouched, floors unnibbled by time or teeth. Plantation ledgers noted repairs everywhere except those structures, as if no one dared enter them after a certain point. Former enslaved people, interviewed decades later during the Works Progress Administration narratives, described quiet houses, places where babies stopped crying, where dogs refused to follow, where prayers changed tone without anyone realizing it. One man recalled a foreman saying, "Let that house be." No reason given. No explanation needed. Animals avoided those places not because they were clean, but because something else had already claimed them. Every untouched slave quarter shared one identical feature. It wasn't architecture. It wasn't location. It wasn't construction material. It was a symbol, carved into door frames, etched beneath floorboards, burned faintly into beams where fire should have erased it. A looping mark, neither African nor Christian, not native, not European. Historians dismissed it as decorative. Clergy called it pagan residue. Plantation owners claimed ignorance, but enslaved elders called it the seal of binding. They said it was placed there to keep something inside, and to keep everyone else out. Rats and snakes, they believed, were wise enough to understand the warning. Humans were not. In 1834, a small Charleston church quietly purchased land containing 3 of the untouched quarters. No sermon announced it. No deed explanation survived. But construction records show something disturbing. The church paid triple market value and immediately sealed the quarters underground rather than demolishing them. Why? Church minutes from that year reference a spiritual containment matter. One line reads, "The soil must not be disturbed further. The mark must remain unbroken." No theological explanation follows. No scripture cited. Only signatures. Years later, when a storm partially exposed one sealed quarter, witnesses reported clergy arriving before sunrise, removing exposed beams, recovering the ground, and blessing the dirt as if performing a burial without a body. Because the body was never the danger. Among enslaved families, children were taught a lullaby never sung past the second verse. The melody was gentle. The words were not. The final verse, elders said, called something to listen. Anyone who finished it dreamed of doors opening beneath their feet, of rooms without corners, of a presence that didn't move, but noticed. One woman claimed her grandmother ended the song early every time and whispered, "It already hears enough." When folklorists tried to record the full song decades later, every informant refused the last verse. Not out of superstition, out of obedience, because the seal was never meant to be broken. And Charleston was built on the lie that it already had been. In 1871, an orphanage was constructed on land no plantation family wanted. The paperwork lists it as unsuitable for agriculture. No reason given. It sat directly above one of the sealed quarters. City planners noted something strange almost immediately. The grounds never suffered infestations. No rodents. No snakes. No burrowing insects. Children complained the soil felt hard, even after rain. The staff praised it as providence. But the children began reporting the same dream. A door beneath their beds. A sound like breathing through wood. A feeling of being counted. Records show several children stopped speaking entirely. Not traumatized, obedient. They followed rules without correction. They sat for hours facing walls. One matron wrote, "They behave as if watched." When a basement renovation exposed part of the old slave quarter foundation, workers refused to continue. One fled the city the same night. Another claimed the carved symbol was warm to the touch. The orphanage closed within 5 years. Official cause, funding. Unofficial result, silence. In 1893, a flood weakened Charleston's lower districts. Foundations cracked. Old structures surfaced. For the first time in nearly a century, part of the seal was broken. That summer, animals returned, but not to the sealed places. They gathered around them. Rats circled buildings without entering. Snakes coiled along property lines. Dogs barked endlessly at empty ground. Then the people began to vanish. Not dramatically, not violently. They simply failed to wake. Death certificates cited unknown causes. No wounds. No illness. No struggle. A physician wrote privately, "It is as though something removed them carefully." After repairs, the animals dispersed. The death stopped. No one investigated further. Because the repairs restored the mark. A theological seminary opened nearby in 1902. Its curriculum included an unusual requirement. Students were forbidden to enter certain city blocks alone. No explanation given. Instead, they were taught a concept called spiritual avoidance, the belief that evil did not always attack, but waited to be acknowledged. A professor wrote, "There are presences that grow stronger through observation." Students whispered that certain hymns were never practiced. Certain scriptures never read aloud. Certain prayers always ended early. Graduates who asked why were reassigned. Graduates who pressed further disappeared from records. The seminary still stands. Its archives remain sealed. In 1919, a city surveyor attempted to chart all vermin-free zones in Charleston. His maps showed a pattern, points forming a containment circle around the oldest part of the city. At the center, a cluster of sealed quarters. He noted, "This is not coincidence. This is design." 2 weeks later, he resigned. 3 weeks later, he burned his notes. 4 weeks later, he drowned in shallow water. No witnesses. Only one surviving map fragment, showing the symbol drawn over the city like a lid. The enslaved were never told what was sealed. They were told why. Because something had been summoned long before chains arrived. Because the land had already been claimed. Because the seal was not protection, it was payment. They believed their suffering fed the containment, and that if it ever ended, the city would finally hear what had been listening all along. Hidden in shipping manifests from 1812 is a reference to a slave quarter never marked. It sat just outside the containment circle. The slaves housed there vanished within a year. No sale records. No burial entries. No transfer notes. The land was left unused for decades. When construction finally began in 1938, workers unearthed no bodies. Only deep impressions in the soil, as if something had rested there long enough to change the earth. The symbol was carved afterward. Too late. A retired choir director admitted in 1944 that Charleston's churches all shared a modified hymn. One verse removed. One cadence altered. The missing verse, when reconstructed, formed a complete invocation. Not a prayer. A release. Music historians later noted the hymn's structure matched older ritual patterns. Call, bind, sustain. The enslaved had known this. That was why the lullaby was unfinished. That was why the song was cut. Because sound was the key. In 1949, a sealed letter was added to the Charleston archives. To be opened only if containment fails. It reads, "What is buried here listens without hunger and waits without impatience. It does not demand belief. Only neglect breaks the seal. Only forgetting invites it." The letter ends with a warning. If the city ever stops remembering why the boundaries exist, the animals will return first. They have. After 1950, Charleston modernized. Roads were paved over old paths. Apartment blocks rose where slave quarters once stood. Church attendance declined. Oral histories faded into footnotes. And slowly, quietly, the rules were forgotten. New residents reported rats returning to parts of the city once untouched. Snakes appeared in basements where none had ever been seen. City pest control treated it as coincidence. But older residents noticed something else. The animals did not spread evenly. They avoided certain shapes in the ground, certain curves beneath concrete. certain places where nothing would grow, as if they still remembered what people no longer did. Teachers in the 1960s documented a strange behavior among children living near former sealed sites. They hummed melodies no one taught them, stopped songs at the same moment, refused to sleep with beds against certain walls. When asked why, one child said, "It listens better there." Psychologists blamed imagination, but the lullaby had returned. Without words, by the 1980s, the seal had become decorative. Architects unknowingly replicated it in iron gates. Artists painted it into murals. Tour guides called it Charleston flair. The boundary was no longer deliberate. It was accidental. And accidents, the letter warned, do not bind. The seal was never meant to trap a monster. It was meant to trap attention. What lay beneath did not move, did not rise, did not escape. It waited to be acknowledged. It fed on remembrance, on ritual, on restraint. Slavery had provided that restraint through suffering. When suffering ended, memory was meant to replace it. Instead, the city chose silence. Today, certain buildings in Charleston remain untouched by pests. Developers can't explain it. Exterminators can't fix it. Residents don't ask, because something still marks those places, not as a prison, but as a reminder. Animals sense boundaries humans ignore, and as long as something remembers the seal, the city remains standing. But forgetting has already begun.